the last section of the book, where it becomes, very, very moving, is where you're looking at child summing up his life basically and deciding to suicide. You want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Well, that spoke to me in many, many ways.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's well known that Child had thought about suicide for a long time. When the Second World War broke out and Hitler's armies were advancing, and when Stalin had signed a pact with Hitler, he and Crawford in 1939, I think, seriously discussed the possibility of committing suicide. Right. Child thought that when the Nazis conquered Britain, he'd be shot anyway, so he was going to commit suicide. In the years or months before he retired from his job as director of the Institute of Archaeology in London, he went around answering people's questions about what he'll do now by saying, I might jump off a cliff.
Right.
So it was clear that he had often thought about how he would end his life.
The important is why.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay, so the suicide note explains it all. It's not a note about, how terrible the world is and how all my ideals have failed and how I'm sick and dying. It's rather a very, very positive thing. I'm going to actually quote a few words from it. Child is a great writer, and this is a very good example of Child at his best.
This is
Yes.
the suicide note that eventually turns up.
That's right, yes. The British prejudice against suicide is utterly irrational. To end his life deliberately is in fact something that distinguishes Homo sapiens from other animals. But I don't intend to hurt my friends by flouting that prejudice. An accident may easily and naturally befall me on a mountain cliff. I have visited my native land and found I like Australian society much less than European. But I have enormously enjoyed revisiting the haunts of my boyhood above all the Blue Mountains. I've answered to my own satisfaction questions that intrigued me then. Now I have seen the Australian spring. I have smelt the boronia, watched snakes and lizards, listened to the locusts. There is nothing more I want to do here, nothing I feel I ought and could do. I hate the prospect of the summer, but I hate more the fogs and snows of a British winter. Life ends best when one is happy and strong.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It is.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and that says it all.
Yeah. So, the last part of the book that you referred to is the part that deals with Child's career while he was contributing to the study of archaeology from the late 20s through to the mid-50s. I have called that section, however, What Happens in History, not something to do with archaeology. And I did that because I wanted to shift people's attention away from the fact that he contributed to the science of archaeology to the way in which he used the discoveries of archaeology to provide an observational scientific basis for historical theory. So that's why the last section is called What Happens in History. It's obviously an echo of this most famous book, What Happened in History. And what I do in this section is I don't bother about the technical books on archaeology that he wrote at that time. I rather just look at a set of books that start in 1936 and go through till the early 50s, in which he's trying to develop a scientific basis for historical materialism. These are these are the most famous books. Man Makes Himself.
Yeah.
What Happens in History,
Yeah.
which ends up with a famous paragraph. It's published in the Second World War, and it's meant to encourage people to be positive and optimistic about the capacity of human beings to remake the world. And progress, he says at the end, it goes up and down, but each crest outtops the last. And there's a famous little pamphlet he wrote for the Young Communist League called The Story of Tools.
Yeah, that's one of my early publications.
Yeah, which gets,
publications that I was interested in. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Gets onto the fact that he sees the mode of production and relations of production as the basis for human cultural development. He never resiles from that. I mean, there are all kinds of books. Archaeologists say, you stop being a Marxist, He never, you read carefully, he still says archaeology must begin with the study of the mode of production. So there's a whole series of books like that lay out his attempt to strengthen the Marxist theory of historical materialism. And he wrote a book just called History. Nothing, some discussions of history or something, but no, just history. Yeah. History. Because he felt so confident about his capacity to say something about the materialist theory of history. And he goes, in the book, he goes through the various approaches to history, the comparativist approach, the theological approach, and so on, and ends up with historical materialism. So, that's the Marx, that's the child that I present then, a child who is devoted all his life to the idea that man makes himself, that human beings create the world in which they live, and can create it better, and can improve it by moving to a higher stage of civilization, socialism or communism. So that's the child, you see, that I want to be remembered. Child's fascinating, I think, as an intellectual in intellectual history, because there can't be many other scholars in the world who have had 3 poems written about them.
Yeah.
Not referenced, but to them. This is a poem about Gordon Child.
Yeah, but we might finish up on that, Terry, but I just want to... it's in the last section too, where you actually, and I find this rather beautiful, it's Child sort of looking back on his life and wondering about the role of the intellectual. Mm. And it's so the antithesis of the modern intellectual world. He develops this idea that the role of the intellectual is to liberate ideas into society. They're not my ideas, they're just ideas. And you let them go out into society, and if they're taken up and they morph into other things, it's like throwing a pebble in a pool or something. That's the idea. You cast it into society, and it goes out. Yes. And it's so opposite of this sort of, this is my idea. I wrote this article. I liberated this idea. Yeah. This is my idea for my promotion, etc., etc., etc. That's drilled into people in the modern academy. Yeah. And he's got this amazing, almost sort of, I used to read Krishnamurti, and that it's almost a sort of a Zen type idea of like. Yes, that's right. It's amazing. I find that beautiful.
He calls that his way of becoming immortal.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But if my ideas are taken up, then I'll be immortal.
But he also dissociates. It's not my idea.
That's right. If the idea is taken up,
it's an egoless.
It becomes part of reality.
It's an egoless.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you want to read one of the poems, I think, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And there were three poems really. Well, one's written by a very famous archaeologist, and it's about Child's first archaeological book called The Dawn of European Civilization, which is republished time and time again. He keeps revising it, and it's an amazing book full of details about the way in which prehistory in Europe occurred. It's full of detail, and this poem simply has a sort of, you know, it's a sort of gentle joke. Look, if you're interested in this particular problem of the Danube, you'll find it in the dawn. You'll find it in the dawn.
Right, yeah.
The other poem is by Jack Lindsay, and he wrote that about his experiences of knowing Child in Brisbane in 1919, and you know, it presents Child as sort of a gentle person who punctured poor ideas, but gently led you on to that. The third poem is by a guy called David Martin, who, despite his name, was a Hungarian, who came to Australia after the Second World War.
He'd also fought in the Spanish Civil War.
He fought in the Spanish Civil War, in fact, yes. And he was a man of the left, and his poem is about the way in which Child's legacy as a left-wing intellectual.
Right, why did you read that?
Yeah, I think it's quite short.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of it at the end of the book.
Yeah, well, this is the whole thing, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so it's called Gordon Child. From this far late-come country that still keeps a primitive and ancient dream, he drew that which is name and changeless. Here he grew, and all his work accomplished, here he sleeps. Scholar and man, his road lay straight through time. With rational affection he restored from shards the road by which the race explored its world and heaven, risen from the slime, not on the wings of mystery, but through shared dread and experience. Ranging free, he saw the gods with Caesar, one before the law of birth and death, decay, and God not spared. Our prehistoric father, who was sent to his last journey with an axe of stone, with this same axe cut through the dark unknown, the road on which Saul to Damascus went. And so, come home, he closed the book and cast upon the fertile winds his unread page. Dying, the hills stood round him, age on age. Man makes himself, each crest outtops the last.
That's beautiful.
Lovely, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Terry, I think on that note,
We think we must.
I think we finished. Yeah. No, I think that.
All right, good.